Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps even also for a couple of our participants. Welcome to session 7 of the 8th Annual International Conference on Sustainable Development. This session is called Accelerating Education for SDGs in Universities. And my name is Dorothea Struber. I'm with the SDSN Secretariat, and I am now going to ask our moderator, Maria Cortes-Puch, Vice President Networks at the SDSN, to connect her camera and microphone to start and kick us off in this plenary session.
Thank you very much, Dorothea. Can you hear me okay? And can you see me? Wonderful. All right, well, it's wonderful to be here to launch one of our highlights of the networks this year, the report Accelerating Education for the SDGs for Universities, colleges, high education institutions. This has been a very exhaustive piece of work that has involved members from around the world. So once again, we're thrilled to be launching it today. I'm going to go very quickly through a couple of housekeeping issues. Let me start with, we have a very packed agenda and a wonderful agenda. We'll have a keynote speech from Professor John Thwaite, have a thorough explanation of the guide and some of the tools that it has from Professor Tahl Kestin, and then we'll have a panel with 4 speakers coming from around the world. I'm going to ask all of the speakers to keep their cameras, especially their microphones off when they're not speaking. We may need to turn the cameras off at some point. And then there is a chat function at the right of your screen where you can post questions. I will be looking at it during the panel to see the questions from the audience. You can also vote the questions that are being posted. And then I hope that we will have time to ask at least one of them to our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Professor John Thwaite, the director of the Monash Institute for Sustainable Development and the chair of our Australia, Pacific and New Zealand SDSN network. John, over to you. John, can you hear me? You're still muted.
I was okay.
Yeah,
I think I'm on. I was on and then I was off, but I'm on now, so that's great. It's great to be here for the launch of this really important guide, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the incredible amount of work that has gone into it. We've only got 10 years left to meet the Sustainable Development Goal targets. And unfortunately, we're a long way away from meeting many of them. I think everyone would acknowledge that to have any chance of meeting the goals, we're going to need to utilise the skills and knowledge of universities. And we also have to remember that many students are being trained by universities now who are then going to be going out into the community and having a big impact on whether we achieve the goals in 2030. The other factor I think we all know is that the COVID-19 pandemic is making it even harder to achieve the goals. But the pandemic is also demonstrating just how important universities are. For example, the COVID-19 vaccine, which we're all hoping will become a reality, is an exercise involving universities and scientific experts all around the world. But also universities are contributing to the public health response to COVID and to the way in which governments are responding through their economic policies and through their social policies. For example, at the university that I'm at, Monash University, and at our institute, the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, we're actually researching COVID-19 related behaviours and working with governments to find the best ways to encourage people to undertake safe behaviours like wearing masks or safe travel, safe work practices. I also think we should acknowledge that university students themselves have a really big role to play in achieving the goals. And we're seeing that now during the COVID crisis, where SDSN youth have come up with a great set of solutions to address SDG 11, that's the Sustainable Cities goal, as it's impacted by COVID-19. So, for example, in their report, they've got some solutions to how cities can tackle the management of increased biomedical waste, which is SDG 11.6, or how cities can safely resume the use of public spaces and reduce disparities in access to green spaces, which is SDG 11.7. So we know how important universities are to achieving the goals, and we also know that universities around the world are committed to them. But many universities are unsure how best they can do this. And that's why in 2017, SDSN, Australia, New Zealand and Pacific produced a guide called Getting Started with the SDGs in Universities. And this was a guide which was prepared by staff from a number of universities in Australia and New Zealand. And that project was led by Dr. Kestin, who you're going to hear from shortly. The guide on getting started with the SDGs in universities identified 4 key areas where universities can have a major contribution. First, research, providing the necessary knowledge and solutions and technologies that are necessary to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Second, education, providing students with the knowledge, the skills, and the motivation to understand and address the goals. Importantly, our operations as universities can also have an impact because many universities are very large, they have quite a big eco footprint, and so implementing the goals in our universities is very important, and that might mean low emission campuses, but it also means our social policies, gender equity, being accessible to students from different backgrounds. And then the fourth area that we identified in the guide for universities is community leadership. This uses the fact that universities are seen as credible, independent players, and they have a real opportunity to stimulate informed debate in the community about the goals and also to influence policy, to work with government and business and the community in implementing policies that actually deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. The guide that we prepared, Getting Started with the SDGs in Universities, identified a number of specific SDG goals and targets where universities could take specific action. And I think it's worth noting that the goal number 4, quality education, there are some 7 goals or targets under that goal where universities can make a direct difference. But of course, it's not only the education goal, universities can make a difference in all goals. So for example, SDG goal number 1, no poverty. Universities can have an impact on that by ensuring that their supply chains are ethical, that they don't contain human slavery. Or universities can provide support structures for students who may be living in poverty. Of course, another really important goal is SDG 5, which is gender equality. And universities have a real role to improve representation of women in university leadership. So in this guide, we provided a lot of case studies for universities so they could see the best practices in other universities. And it turned out that this was pretty popular, and the guide has now been translated into 5 languages. And I urge you to look it up. It's on the web, and you can find a lot of really helpful information there. And the guide did contain some helpful information for universities in planning their education for students, and particularly education around sustainable development. I think an important point that it highlighted is that education for sustainable development is not just about teaching knowledge or facts about the sustainable development goals. It's about developing cross-cutting skills and competencies for students that they're going to need in their careers if they're going to solve these difficult and complex problems. Skills like systems thinking or self-awareness, entrepreneurship. But the guide that we prepared a few years ago was really just the first step. It doesn't go into the detail that universities want and need if they're going to excel in education for sustainable development. So 2 years ago at this International Conference on Sustainable Development, there was a workshop on education for the Sustainable Development Goals, which was attended by educators from universities all around the world. And the main takeaways from this workshop were that first, there was a shared perspective that educating on the Sustainable Development Goals presented some major challenges for professors and universities. Second, that there wasn't a lot of guidance on how to address these educational challenges or what other universities were doing. And third, the conclusion of the workshop was that a practical guide could offer some really useful analysis about how best universities can train their students in sustainable development, but importantly, give them the broad capacities and skills that they're going to need to solve complex problems. And so from this workshop, the SDSN decided to prepare a similar resource to the previous guide, but really focusing on education for the Sustainable Development Goals with a very pragmatic approach. And the guide has been prepared by university educators from around the world, and you're about to hear from one of those leaders, Dr. Tahl Kestin, who's my colleague at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. I think what's really exciting, though, about the guide is that it has led now to a community of practice that's going to continue to meet and learn from each other. And as Julio Lumbreras from Technical University of Madrid said to me, this is creating a community of people working on the issue. So congratulations to everyone involved, and I'm sure this guide will be really useful. Thank you.
John, for your inspiration and for setting the frame so well around the specific issues that universities face. You can see that in the chat there's already quite a bit of discussion around some of these questions. I'm going to give the floor now to Dr. Tahl Kestin, the lead author of this guide, to go through some of the tools that are offered and how the guide is organized. Tahl, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and I will share my screen and presentation, and hopefully it will all work perfectly. Okay, so hello everyone. As John said, my name is Tahl Kestin. I work at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I'm the network manager for SDSN Australia, New Zealand and Pacific. It's my privilege and pleasure today to share with you a bit about the guide that we are launching today on behalf of a guide team, and it has been a real team effort and a pretty huge effort, as Maria implied earlier. And in particular, I want to mention Maria and Julio Lumbreras from UPM, who have been my colleagues on the guide editorial team. and also quite a large group from UPM, from Monash, from SDSN, who've been really instrumental in contributing different sections, in reviewing, currently also translating, and developing the case study website that we'll talk a bit about at the end. We also want to acknowledge that we've had over almost 150 other people contributing in different ways to the guide from universities all over the world, and their contributions have really been instrumental in the backbone of what we've put in, because it is very easy to say really what universities should do about education for sustainable development, but it's the actual reality of what this looks like is a lot more complex. So let me just get started, and just in a nutshell, I want to explain what the guide is about. So Accelerating Education for the SDGs is a guide to inspire and empower universities, colleges, tertiary and higher education institutions. And note that we're using the word university as a shortcut or shorthand for all of these types of tertiary institutions, to provide their learners with the knowledge, skills and mindsets to contribute to solving the world's sustainable development challenges and achieving the sustainable development goals. And we do this by offering practical approaches, guidance, resources and inspirational case studies. So this is kind of in a nutshell what the guide is about, but my role today is to give you a little tour of what is in the guide, and very briefly what's in it and what are the key messages. And we're going to start by very briefly thinking about what the term education for the SDGs actually means, and some of the contested or unclear meanings around that. But then think about really what does that actually mean to universities, and I want to share with you right at the start some of the key things that we came up with when we put the guide together about why it's relevant for universities. I'll then take you through the different chapters, which are basically organised by the why, the what and the how of education for the SDGs at universities. And then finally go through, tell you about the case study website that we've put together. And right to wrap up, a few links and next steps for you to consider. Now, this is going to be a very brief tour, and I think there's a lot of issues and things that I'm going to gloss over that I think people will want to discuss more deeply. I don't know if there will be a chance at this session, but there will, I think, opportunities in later times. And please download the guide. I think it's available now, and hopefully that will answer some of your questions. So the way we've defined education for the SDGs is what John was talking about earlier, around providing learners with the knowledge, skills and mindsets to contribute to solving the world's complex sustainable development challenges and to achieving the SDGs through whichever profession or path they choose in life. And there's been, I guess, different interpretations of what this actually means. And some people, for example, would consider education for the SDGs addressing SDG 4.7, which calls for all learners to be able to promote sustainable development, or they think about it in terms of education for sustainable development, which has been around for decades as a really tried and tested pedagogy and practice for how to engage learners in sustainable development. Now, we've chosen to use the term education for SDGs quite specifically for two reasons. One is that we think the SDGs actually capture a much broader range of issues and approaches than traditional education for sustainable development. And secondly, we think now is the time to, I guess, advocate for this kind of approach to education, because the SDGs are really engaging a lot of universities, and it's the SDGs themselves that are exciting and inspiring universities, and we need to use the SDGs as the vehicle to try and advocate for change. Now, why do we need to talk about it for universities? It might seem obvious if you're in a university, but it's not necessarily the case elsewhere. So while there's a lot of discussion around SDG 4.7 and education for the SDGs, it's often just in the context of primary and secondary education. And while the universities all over the world are trying lots of different things around this, there's nothing that really kind of synthesizes what education for the SDGs looks like for universities and institutions. What do they need to be doing differently? So this is kind of what the guide was trying to answer. So what are the key messages as far as we came up with from the guide? So firstly, that education for the SDGs is a critical role for universities, and we believe that universities should be aiming to mainstream it to all of their learners. Secondly, that to do that, they need to scale up existing activities, because some universities are already doing things that would be considered education for the SDGs, but actually they also need to implement a lot of new activities and new types of activities, and that can be quite challenging. Thirdly, that what this looks like will be different for each university, depending on kind of where they're starting from and their context, but that a process, a university-wide process, can really help identify the best path. And fourthly, that there are some aspects of delivering education for the SDGs that are quite hard to address within existing university structures. And there might be some areas where universities need to transform how they operate in order to deliver them faster and effectively. So let me start briefly going through what is in the different chapters. So the first chapter is really asking, why does education versus the SDGs matter to universities? And we answer it in 3 different ways. Firstly is that society needs education with the SDGs, and John touched on that very eloquently around the urgency of action on climate change and on achieving the SDGs, and that we really need everyone on board. And so we can't afford to only have a few people who are motivated and have the capacity to solve these kinds of problems. We want everyone to be involved. Secondly, we believe that universities are in a really unique position to deliver this. And there's a few reasons for that. And one is that they actually reach a cohort of potential learners that no other educational sector does. And that's pretty much everyone who's beyond secondary education, including professionals and lifelong learning, which is a very large number of people. And we can't wait for everyone who's in secondary education and primary education to graduate to their professions. We need to be reaching these people now. And thirdly, that actually universities can benefit from doing it. And I guess the most obvious one is that with many of them actually committing and engaging with the SDGs, they actually need to be demonstrating that engagement, and education for the SDGs is a pretty key component of that. But also that the kinds of skills and knowledge that the SDGs require align really quite well with the kind of future-ready and 21st century skills that universities are already having conversations on. So what does education for the SDGs actually look like in a university? That is actually, there's a lot of different ways or aspects to the answer to this, and this is what Chapter 2 tries to map out. I want to highlight 2 specific things. Firstly, what it actually includes, and secondly, the approaches that are needed to deliver some of the things, the skills and the knowledge, because they really determine the the process and the complexity of integrating these into universities. So as John touched briefly, there's a lot of different things that people say is education for the SDGs, but they fall into 4 main categories that we can see. So one is around cross-cutting skills and competencies, again, systems thinking, entrepreneurship, creativity, empathy, design thinking, ethical thinking. There's lots and lots of things that have been falling into this bucket that people are really considering that are important for solving these complex challenges. Secondly, it's around a general knowledge of sustainable development and the SDGs. So what is climate change? What is the issues globally around poverty? So just having a grounding in the big problems that the world is facing. The third one is around profession-specific knowledge and skills, and that's how people can address the SDGs through whatever profession they're doing, whether they're a lawyer or a teacher or a health worker or a business person. They each have a unique way of contributing and addressing the SDGs and quite specific skills around how to do that. And finally, it's about mindsets and attitudes to actually want to contribute to these kinds of things. That we're seeing more and more students coming into the university with this, but not all of them do, and not all of them know how to get going. The second thing we want to highlight is around the kinds of settings and delivery methods that are needed to, I guess, pass on or to actually help students and learners gain these skills, knowledge, and mindsets. And there's 3 areas that seem common across all the examples we've seen, and that's around delivering interdisciplinary settings. So it's not just students within one course necessarily, but there's interaction across different disciplines. That the learning is very action-based or project-based around real-world problems. And finally, that they involve a lot of interaction with other actors, both within other areas of the university, like in living labs, but also in external stakeholders. So these are kind of the unique aspects of what we consider to be education for the SDGs. And another aspect is that actually these kinds of things are relevant to all learners, and by learners in a university, they can mean both the students and the staff and other stakeholders that the universities have. So they can really apply very broadly. And the good news, I guess, is that because the SDGs are so broad and cover so many topics, there's actually ways of incorporating them into existing university activities. So there's lots of different ways of doing them. But some of the more common approaches that we've seen that universities take to provide education for the SDGs have been around things like awareness raising or creating interdisciplinary introductory units that students from across the university can join, or even doing ones that are specific to a discipline. So all business students, and what does sustainable development and the SDGs mean for them. There's also a lot of co-curricular and student-led activities, and often these can do things that are quite innovative and are quite difficult to achieve in a more structured curricular process. There's a lot of online content, and some universities are implementing one extreme depth around sustainable development degrees. So I guess things to consider when you think about how you go about managing all this information and options is that all these different options actually differ in terms of how suitable they are to action-based learning and those kinds of things, how deep a knowledge or skills they provide and how many students they reach. And in the guide, we provide some guidance around how you can look at different kinds of options and assess them according to these things. But the bottom line is that if you want education for the SDGs to reach a lot of students, you can't just do one thing. There's no one approach that would work for all students and for all the kinds of elements that you want them to receive, but it will require some combination of those. So the how is obviously the next question, and that's not easy, and we want to put that out there. But we do, in chapter 3, suggest a strategic process, which is actually based on what we did in the original guide, around 5 steps.
Tahl, can you hear me?
Where you start by identifying your process.
Tahl, sorry, this is Maria. You have 2 minutes left.
Oh. Okay, all right, that's fine. I can manage. So just broadly, chapter 3 is really looking at this whole of university process and also at some of the barriers and challenges that universities and people within universities might come across, and some solutions or ideas on how to overcome them. So this is one where you'll definitely need to go into the guide and have a look at this in more detail, and also looks at the different stakeholders that can contribute, which we consider to be pretty much everyone. Now, chapter 4 is again on the how, but it does look at the more transformative approaches, because delivering things like interdisciplinary learning, action-based learning is hard to implement within current course structures within universities. And there's actually a need to really rethink how a university is structured to make them more effective. And I'll leave you to read that chapter, and there's a few very in-depth case studies in that chapter around how universities are trying to transform the way they're doing things to deliver more effective education for the SDGs. So I guess the final element I want to talk about is the case studies, and this all sounded very theoretical until now, but we did go through quite a process to collect case studies of what universities around the world are doing. And we got well over 100 case studies, and we've only been able to select about 50 of them to include in a website that is now open and available to everyone. And there's some really exciting and interesting and in-depth examples that we can all learn and be inspired from. And that actually, the reason I need to get off is that you can actually hear from some of the people who contributed these case studies and get their lived-in experience. So before I finish though, just some suggestions and where to go from here. Firstly, you can download the guide, is now up on the SDSN website, as well as the blog, the case study website on the UPM University, set that up. And there's several SDSN programs that work in ways that are very aligned to what the guide is doing, and is an opportunity to, I guess, join in part of this community. And that's the national and regional SDSN networks, the SDG Academy's Community of Practice program, and SDSN Youth SDGs Students program. So we hope that this guide is useful to you, and of course we're always open to feedback and to hear more from you. So thank you very much for that, and I'll pass it on to Maria now. If I can.
For the wonderful presentation. So indeed, we're now moving into a panel discussion with participants from around the world. I'm going to ask them to turn their cameras on while I start introducing them. So we have Maria Garcia Alvarez, lecturer from Windesheim University of Applied Sciences, joining from the Netherlands. We have Tawana Cooper, Vice Chancellor and Principal from the University of Pretoria. We have Ram Kumar, co-founder and lead strategy from UniGlow, and we have Carlos Mataix, director of the ITD, joining from the Polytechnic University Madrid. So we have, let's just see if we can get Carlos Mataix also on the screen. So wonderful, so we can see everyone. So we wanted this to be a very interactive panel. As Tahl has mentioned, we did an open call for case studies just to understand what it was that universities were doing on this particular field. And as Tahl has mentioned, and I think John did too in his presentation, one of the things that the presenters of case studies were telling us was this is not easy. There are many challenges in trying to reach across faculties. Sometimes we face with a lot of bureaucracy from the university to try to put forward innovative solutions. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you all is what were some of these challenges and what were some of the barriers that you found in trying to educate on sustainable development, specifically using the framework of the SDGs, and how did your particular example address them? So I'm going to perhaps start by giving the floor to Maria Garcia Alvarez. Please go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think next to the ones, Maria, that you already mentioned, the bureaucratic problems, etc. And I think I was checking the questions of the participants. First of all, it's also the lack of training, the lack of knowledge about why this agenda is important, and the lack of training for a lot of lectures on what do I do with this agenda. It is not a pedagogical framework. So that was barrier number one. Second, obviously, to change the traditional model of education, which is based in transmission and transaction of knowledge, not transformative knowledge, and analytical approaches, not systemic approaches, which are needed when we are addressing such complex problems. So what, linking to the second question you're posting to us, what we try to do is try to put the students in a new educational concept we call it value creation, where we put the students in the situation of ambiguity and uncertainty, which is also quite needed, and to move from this knowledge as a goal to knowledge as a tool, and to explore also the agenda in collaboration with professional networks. We cannot, in education, we're also quite problem and product focused. And I think for us, it worked really to allow the students to focus in the process, not so much in what you're going to deliver at the end, because the problem of these problems that we have with SDGs is that you have to go beyond the problem. You have to understand the system. And in education, I have the feeling sometimes, I don't know what my colleagues will think, that we have moved so much to analytical approaches that we have forgotten about systematic thinking and systems thinking and systemic approaches. So that's what we try to address with a lot of ingredients like theory of change, a lot of imagination, and training our lecturers to move from lecturing to coaching, and also in working in collaboration with external networks, working together. That is the key element, at least for us.
Wonderful. These are very insightful thoughts. I'm actually going to give the floor next to Vice Chancellor Coupe, because the University of Pretoria indeed thought about the whole university as a system, right, when trying to address these challenges. So if you could just give us some insights on what this meant.
No, thank you very much, Maria. I'm excited to be part of this panel. For us, as you said, we decided that we have to mobilize the entirety of the university as a system, as an organization. So we wrote in a vision of achieving the SDGs as part of the university strategic plan, which ends in 2025, but we'll be able to extend it for another 5 years because we use 5-year planning cycles to 2030. So in that vision of the university, one of the key pillars is, one, of course, is human development. The other is societal impact beyond achieving the normal academic indexes, H indexes, citations, excellence awards, Nobel Prizes, if you can. What we drive is, how do you translate personal human development and research and knowledge creation into societal impact? So we've done a number of things that are very, very important in the integration. First, we know the following, that complex societal problems that are complicated and hard to achieve, like the SDG, are not packaged in disciplines, but universities operate in disciplines and in silos. Even when they say they are multidisciplinary, it simply means everybody comes and says, I'm an economist, I'm a sociologist, I'm an engineer. That is not working, and that will not work for the SDGs. You need to go further. So we said interdisciplinarity, we actually use the word transdisciplinarity, is going to be important. The reason why we prefer to use transdisciplinarity is that everybody must get uncomfortable. Everybody must get out of their comfort zones and achieve something bigger than themselves. And so we know also that in academic institutions, it's not enough for the Vice Chancellor to say, now we are transdisciplinary, now we are going to achieve the sustainable development, because it doesn't work. People will say, let him get lost, he's dreaming, he's drinking something. So what we decided to do is that there will be something that will bring the university together. First was launch iconic flagship degree programs. So we have 2 degree programs that are important in this regard. A Master's in Development Practice that is highly sought after by people from across the African continent, not just South Africa. Second, a Master's in Tangible Heritage Conservation. This is a degree for people who work in the art space. They curate, they restore works of art, but also they test works of art for whether they are fake or not. So it requires both to be taught by both scientists, because restoring a work of art is a scientific enterprise, right? But it requires people who know art history, identity, culture, people's confidence, because development is not possible if people do not have confidence in their own identities. And it's led by a chemistry professor, not an art historian. And so we did, and development practice is the same thing as well. It's led by an economist, but a development economist who believes in participatory development approaches. Then the big thing we really did was the following, was to launch 4 transdisciplinary collaborative research platforms. Nobody is allowed to say, I work at the institute. You go into the institute if you are going to work with others to co-create new knowledge that can be translating into solving complex problems, the ones that are associated or framed by the UN as the SDGs. So there's no instrumental approach. You have to say, what is a societal problem? What is its alignment with the SDGs? What is its alignment with national and continental research agendas? Because the problem is many people now want to just simply rewrite what they do to fit the SDGs. Exactly. That is a compliance exercise. That is a tick box exercise. What you want to change is to have a decisive difference in actually impacting society in such a way that when the history is told, it will say, if it was not for that university over there, we would not have made progress on climate change, on gender equality, on poverty, on quality education. So we have these 4 platforms, Future Africa Institute and Campus, physical, we used about 100 billion rand, or say about $10 million US. So we built engineering 4.0 for smart cities, smart mobility, and students are taught in there. So we are using the transdisciplinary platforms to change the traditional university. So because if you don't do that, it's not going to happen. Yeah. So we also have a Javet UP Art Center, it's the same thing. Then Innovation Africa at UP for agriculture, forestry, biotechnology. Nobody goes there unless you bring others from other disciplines. But that's not enough. you have to bring others from the African continent, and you have to bring global partners in and outside the university, civil society, business, and government. So you can impact policy, monitoring, and evaluation, and really make genuine, progress that is ethics and integrity in it. That's my story.
Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor Coupe. This is so inspiring. And let me just say that when we were looking at the case studies, which we received, I think 120 or so from around the world, one of the things that we were specifically looking into is, let's not get the business as usual. Let's make sure that we're not representing things that were being done before the framework of the SDGs, but are now being labeled SDGs. But we're really looking for cases that use the agenda and really looked for very transformative approaches. And I'm going to give the floor now to Carlos Mataix, because I think the example is similar in the impact and in the transformational capacity, but starting from a very different approach from a small center in the university that then affects the university as a whole. Carlos, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Maria. Are you hearing me? Yes. Okay. Nice to be here, and very nice to see that what Maria and Tawana have told is very similar to what we are experimenting here in Madrid. I think universities are very different, but the kind of problems that we have to address when applying SDG agenda are common. So I think we know a lot about what we have to do, and what we have to do is to start quickly, because the time is limited. And then I would say that a very important barrier that we have to add to what you have told before is the incremental mentality of those who are responsible for applying the agenda and the university, thinking that in a business as usual and linear approach, we are going to success, and it's not going to work in this way. And a proof of this is the tendency to planning, the planning pathology, I call it. Before doing things, we have to plan it very carefully, and we spend years planning and thinking that we are going to be able to apply the agenda in a linear approach. And I think what we have ahead is a real change management process. For this, in our university, we had an interesting experience that was to create a new operative system in the university, an interdisciplinary center that allows the community of the university to experiment how to do things in a different way, and creating a real connecting tissue, not only between teachers and students and the university community, but also very open to collaboration with the society. Thanks to this, we have started to spread a way of doing things. I would say we have also created an emotion on how things could be in the university, and it's been really contagious. And it is starting to change things, not only in the bottom of the system, but always in the top of the system, on how the responsibles, the vice rectors, provosts, rectors, and so on, understand the possibilities and the opportunity of the agenda, not only for contributing to the mission, but also as a leverage for the change management process that we need at universities.
Carlos, I think this is a crucial point. Not all universities have the lack of having a leadership like Vice Chancellor Coupe that can see this very clearly and wants to shake the very foundation of the university. I'm going to now give the floor to our colleague joining from India, Ram Kumar, and maybe start focusing back on the topic of education. The case study that he presented is a very innovative way of teaching the SDGs, very transdisciplinary also, and involving real societal problems. So Ram Kumar, could you give us a bit of a sense of how this project was implemented, and then what were some of the key findings and outcomes from it?
Thank you, Maria, and also very inspired to hear from the Vice Chancellor and Carlos as well. Yeah. So coming to the point, like for me, when I started, it was from a student perspective. So I started this project UniGlow while I was a student. So as a student, I thought education system was very theoretical and it needs to be practical. And that's where the initial start happened at University of Leicester. And they supported it, and we had some partnership with the United Nations, and slowly we were able to progress. But the main thing was to get the buy-in of the management and get to have the top management believe in the concept. So at the first level, it was like I implemented a small project at University of Leicester as a small student project, and the management was happy, and they gave me an opportunity to scale it to a bigger level. I can talk about it more in future, in future questions. You have a few things lined up. And coming to this particular case study, it is in India. It is at Tyagarajar College of Engineering, where I studied my MCA. So there was a little bit good connect between the institution, and institution was able to understand what I was going through, and the management understood the importance of it, because we have technology in one area, and the most important thing is how it can be used to solve social problems. If students are not solving problems, then education is not complete. That's what, if education is not innovative and addressing a social problem, then maybe we are not, we need to look into the direction. And that cannot be compelled. We need to make students interested in it process. And that's how it started. And initially, of course, the management was interested in it because they had some understanding, and convincing the students initially was a challenge. They all focus on their employability to get a job and so on. But once we started at a very small level, if you want, I can give that example later, but only a couple of students, only a handful turned up, but that reverberates. So I used to say, never underestimate the power of a common student. In fact, they are the ones who have the power to change. So even if it is a small set of students, we went along with them, and then slowly it picked the momentum, and we were able to go about. And there are some specific examples of how we went through and how we faced few challenges and how we came up through. Maybe I can answer those as we go through the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We actually only have 7 minutes left. We have to finish Peel. So there's been one question that is the one that has been most voted, going once again to all the turnaround back to education. That sort of hints that what is missing is the commitment to include sustainable development and competencies in all programs, as opposed to having it as an elective or just a course that students can decide whether or not to take. Maria, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this? And Ram Kumar, could I ask you to mute your microphone until? So I'll ask you all to give just a quick a quick statement on.
For me, the question is, if we take a look at the latest reports from United Nations on climate, the last one in biodiversity last week is like, we have two choices in the coming 10 years. And John was mentioning also the deadline of 10 years, whether we transform or we prepare for disaster. So I think the first scenario, transformation, and there's no transition without transformation, is more positive and promising and exciting for us and for the students. So what do we need to start doing? We can do this together. Politicians are not going to change this world, but teachers can be, and educators, great change agents. So I believe we can do it, and we have a decade in front of us. So to start doing.
Much for that very inspiring response. Vice Chancellor Coupe, do you have a one-line thought about this? Unfortunately, you're still on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was muted. You were muted. Unmute yourself. So, fortunately, 33,000 of our 55,000 students do social engagement or community engagement as part of their course or as something that they manage themselves but it must be based from their teaching and research. So we're now going to try and extend it to every student, so that if all 55 students, either in their particular degree program, and that must bring transdisciplinary elements, and we are using COVID as a moment to rethink and reimagine the university. I've done 2 papers already for that, which are being discussed in the community. Then last but not least, we want all students now to do 2 courses, which will use SDGs as part of the content: compulsory, non-credit worthy, critical diversity studies, and then embed however you want any SDG or a combination. Second, critical media and information literacy, because we live in the world of fake news and fake information. But we also live in a world where there's much more scientific and other co-created knowledge information. But fake news is taking over, and fake information. So we need to, and that is dangerous for the SDGs, as we have seen through COVID. So deeper social engagement and more critical thinking courses that use the SDGs as a scaffolding or as a content, because that way you can spread awareness of the SDGs as well.
Thank you very much for those very inspiring words. Carlos, let's move over to you. These are concluding remarks.
No, of course. I would say that to provoke collaboration, a collaborative culture in the university is crucial at this point. And I think collaboration is not the result of repeating a word, a collaboration, partnership, blah, blah, blah. No, it's the result of investing institutional resources, of investing also some money, and it's a result of taking risks. So I would say we have to be bold to transform the culture, the kind of leadership that we have at our universities, and to provoke unlikely relationships, deep collaboration between among the community and with the university and the other stakeholders. It's not going to be spontaneous. We have to invest in a broad sense of the investing idea.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carlos. Ram Kumar, your last thoughts about the
taking responsibility. Yeah, if you want a one-liner, taking personal responsibility, whether it is a student or a staff member or a management. So if everyone is able to take responsibility, yeah, that's my one-liner. Maybe I can answer a question if you have another one. Yeah.
This is fantastic, Ram Kumar, a wonderful way to close. So unfortunately, we have to end here. We would like to continue for another 2 hours because this is such an engaging and fascinating panel. So let me just say that, first of all, this is just the launch of the guide. As John and Tahl mentioned, the guide is going to be the vehicle for these discussions, because what we want is to create spaces for universities to share experiences and how they surmounted their difficulties, the transformations that they underwent, etc. So stay tuned. Stay tuned at SDSN, so unsdsn.org. As it has been mentioned, what we're trying to do at SDSN is mobilizing universities in support of the SDGs, but we do not work together. The first thing that we do is collaborate in networks that go beyond universities. We work with the public sector, with the private sector, and we work in spaces where we conduct the research that is needed. We try to look for solutions, and we are feeling the urgency that was mentioned today. If your university is not a member of SDSN, we encourage you to become a member and then to engage your local network. So we have here several colleagues from networks, including Vice Chancellor Kupe, that is going to be leading the university, the network at South Africa's Pretoria University. Thank you everyone for joining, and you can download the report. And so it was wonderful to have you all here, and thank you to all of our speakers for participating today. Have a very good day.
Thank you all. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, colleagues, for your wonderful
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, Carlos.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all your efforts.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
And thanks to all the participants for actively engaging. In case if you're not able to connect, I have left my LinkedIn as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.